Okay, so last time out we saw that walking into the spikes that we created makes us suddenly disappear, and it's not very clear what really happened. To be honest, it kind of looks like the game slightly broke. Who knows what really happened there? So what we need to do now is create a particle effect that will show that we've been hit and we've been killed, basically. So we're just going to zoom in a little bit here so we can see things a little bit closer. What I'm going to do is go up to Game Object up here and go down to Particle System. And if we look here, this creates an object that will emit all these little tiny little bubbles, they look like almost, and it'll just repeatedly keep doing them until we start making some changes here that are going to affect how it works. So particle systems are kind of fun to mess around with yourself. You can achieve different results by messing around with all the different values, and if you want to spend some time here kind of like looking at what everything does, it's an interesting tool to use within Unity to cause some kind of interesting effects. So what we're going to do though is, first thing we want to do is shorten down the lifetime of the system. So we're going to set this to be 1, like that. We don't want to mess with the speed or anything like that just yet, but we do want to go down here and go down to emission. And so when we die, we don't want it to just be firing a whole load of bubbles up into the air like this. We wanted to blast out as if our player's being destroyed. So to do that, what we'll do is go to rate here and set this to be 0. And if we go to bursts down here and hit the little plus symbol, we currently have the minimum and maximum set to be 30. So we can see what's happening is that our burst kind of comes out like that, which is, we're starting to get somewhere towards what we want, but we're not quite there yet. So we're going to set our minimum to be 10 and our maximum to be 15. So it'll be a little bit random, a little bit more interesting. And actually, just back up here, we want to set the duration here to be 1 second. So what's happening now is waiting 1 second between each one of these, and it's creating the little burst. Now obviously when we want it to take place, we only want one burst to come out at a time, but we'll cover that in a minute. So the next thing we want to do after we've sorted out the way the emissions are coming out is go into shape here. So at the moment it's coming out in this kind of cone shape like this, which is fine, but it's not really what we want. We want it to kind of burst out in a circle. So if we go to shape here and we go down to circle, what we get is this thin little line, which is obviously doesn't look much like a circle, but that's because if we scroll back up to here, whenever a particle system is placed within Unity, it by default it has a rotation applied to it, and this is kind of more because of how it's used within when you're making 3D games and stuff like that. So what we're going to do is just set that to be 0 like that, and now all of a sudden we have our particles coming out in a circle around the center point. Okay, we'll actually just drag the radius down here like this, so they're more specifically coming out of one point rather than a whole bunch of areas. We'll actually set it to be 0.5, because that's roughly, if we drag this over to the player here, that's roughly the size of the player like that. Okay, so now that we've got our basics of our burst set up here, let's do a couple of more little changes. So white is kind of a little bit of a strange color. We're going to set this to be red, so it kind of looks like, I don't know, like the player himself is exploding kind of almost. You can set it whatever color you want, obviously. Actually no, let's set it to be roughly the same color as the player. So we'll go down to our blue color here, kind of roughly that color. That'll be fine. But the problem at the moment is this huge big massive spread is not very accurate looking. It's too much of a burst. It looks too explosive. So if we go over to start speed here, we're going to pull this down. I'm going to set it to be 2.5, and we can see it kind of looks a little bit more smooth now. But the only problem is at the moment we're getting the particles kind of suddenly disappear when they get to the end. When they reach as far out as they'll go, they suddenly disappear, and that's not really much good to us. That kind of looks a bit strange if all of a sudden the particles are just gone. So what we're going to do is go down here and go to size over lifetime. We're going to hit the little check circle beside it and then click on the name of it itself. And if we click on this little grey bar, we get a little kind of curve system we can play with. Again, you can mess around with all this stuff and see what you like yourself, but what I'm going to do here is drag the right hand side of the bar down, and what that does is it makes it go from being a full size when it starts, and over time it shrinks down until you can't see it anymore. So now if we're looking at our particles here, we can see it really looks like they're kind of exploding and then fading away into oblivion, basically. Okay, so that's all well and good, but the only thing now is that our particle is still repeating over and over again, and we obviously don't want that. It's very handy when we're creating our particle system and sorting it all out to be able to see it repeating so that we can see what's going on. But if we go up here and turn off looping, we can see what happens is it just stops. So we have our particle kind of simulator going on here. So if we hit stop on that and then hit simulate again, it'll do 1 and it'll stop. So that's exactly what will happen with our particle system when the game runs. So we'll hit simulate and nothing happens. Simulate, disappears. That's kind of exactly what we want to happen within our game. So we've got our particle system now, and if we hit play, we'll see that in the game it just kind of runs once and then stops and then it's gone. But now we need to actually make that happen when our player gets killed. And it's very straightforward to do that, but first we need to make this particle system a prefab. And before we do that, of course, we should probably give it a new name. So let's call it we call it the death explosion, because you're exploding when you die, so it seems like a sensible enough name. So let's drag this into our prefabs folder, and now we have a prefab made of our particle, so we can delete it from our scene here. We don't need to worry about it there anymore. And now, because we know that our player is being respawned by our level manager, we're going to make some changes to the level manager script. So go into our scripts folder and open up the level manager here, and we go into our level manager. Okay, so obviously to be able to make this prefab appear in the world, we're going to want to know which object it is that we want to appear, because we have so many prefabs, we need to pick out which one specifically. So we'll need a reference up here to which prefab we want. So we're going to say public game object, and I'm going to call this death explosion, if I can spell, but that doesn't mean anything. We can call this whatever we want. Actually, that needs to be a capital G, sorry. That could be anything. Just because we called it the same thing, it won't magically know what the object is that we want. So we need to save this, go back into the game, and go to our level manager here. And once it compiles, we'll see we get an extra slot here for the death explosion. And if we go then into our prefabs, we'll drag that into that right slot there. So perfect, we've got the right object there. So now we need to know, how can we make it appear in the world? So what we're going to use is a thing called instantiate. And what instantiate does, it basically creates a copy of whatever object you want and places it in the scene wherever you tell it to go. So we're just going to go below where our player is deactivated. So as soon as the player is deactivated, we want this little particle effect to happen and explode into the world. So we'll say here instantiate, if I could spell it, instantiate, and then we'll have an open bracket. Okay, so we have instantiate just means to create an object. Now if we look at our little tooltip thing here, we got one of 3 different options here. So if we can press up and down between them, we can see some different options of what we want to do. So by default it would just create an object, but it won't really know where to place it, so it'll just kind of place it at 0 and 0. The second one we don't really need to worry about, it kind of does roughly the same thing. But the third one is what we're actually going to be looking at using here. So we'll be choosing what object we want to place, we'll be choosing a position that we want to put it in, and we have to also give it a rotation in the world that we want to put it in. So we know what object we want to use. We want to use our death explosion up here. So we'll type in first our death explosion. Then we'll put a comma and a space. So next thing we need is a position. So obviously the position we want this to happen is where the player just died. So we will say the player dot transform dot position. And then we'll also need a rotation. And obviously our rotation is we wanted to go with the same place where the player was, so we might as well put it at the same rotation that the player was at. So we'll say the player dot transform dot rotation. Okay, and that's pretty much it. That's all we need to add to our level manager script. So now if we go back in here, as soon as we can wait for it to compile in the corner, we'll hit our play button, and we should see when we walk into the spikes this time, we get a nice little explosion like that. The same will happen now if we fall off the screen, although our kill box is so far down we won't really see the explosion or anything. But we could move the kill box up a bit closer if we wanted to. But you can see we're getting a particle effect is creating just when we kill ourselves like that. Now, if you're looking over to the left here at our hierarchy, you might be noticing that we're getting a whole bunch of these particle effect explosions appearing in the world. And that's what happens when you instantiate something. When you instantiate it, just because that particle effect is finished running, it doesn't know that it's no longer useful in the world. We've created it in the world, and it's just there. So we need a way to get rid of an object when it's finished being useful, basically. So that's what we're going to take a look at next.